Trimming demonstration, make sure that your piece is like nice and leather hard before you begin. So leather hard again consists of still nice and moist clay that's ideal for carving and trimming, but that yet it's not sticky when you touch it when you sit down to work. Making sure that the surface of your wheel is nice and clean. The way we need to start by trimming is to turn the piece upside down. So much like when you trim a piece, when you throw a piece, when you center that clay, you need to center this. So if I turn my wheel on, do you see how it's not centered? Do you see how when I put my finger next to it, it kind of bumps? That is not like a proper way to start with trimming, because if I start to come at this with my trimming tool, one side will be trimmed a lot, the other side will not, and it'll become this uneven foot, and then more than likely I'll trim through the form itself. So I'm going to show you two different techniques on how to get this centered upside down. So the number one most common way as a beginner is for you to take your needle tool. Let me find mine. Okay, great. And so first and foremost is to, come in here with your needle tool on the side. So you're holding it, supporting your body, and you're nice and steady, and you kind of bump into the form, making marks. And so what happens is that mark, you start from one side of that mark to the other, and let me turn it around, okay? From one side of that mark to the other, you find the center of it, and then you push it over to kind of try to get it to point into the center. You wipe away that mark, and then you begin again, right? And then you do it again, okay? And then you find those two marks, and then you push a little bit more and go on, okay? So that is the most common beginning practice way to learn how to center. You're kind of pushing this thing around until you find it in complete center point. I've never been good at that technique. I think it's because I'm just not patient enough for it. So I, as a very beginning thrower, had decided that I would approach it very similarly to the way that I center the clay. So when you have a piece of clay and you're centering it with your hands, you become very centered and still, and then the clay comes to your point of centeredness. So what I do is I take my thumb and my middle and my ring finger, and I put my hands around the sides of the form up to where the foot's going to be trimmed, not at the base, because this is not where it's going to be trimmed. You want it to be centered up here. You put your hands around the side, and you get your wheel moving fairly slow, but not too slow, and you start to spin it around until all 4 points have the same amount of pressure on your fingers. And then you pull away, you speed up your wheel, and you check, and then it's centered. Does that make sense? Do you guys do that? The third way of centering is let's throw this thing back off again, is to put one hand in front of your body, supporting, and then with your right hand, or your most dominant, you kind of tap it into place. And I'm not very good at this technique, as you can see. Let me slow down a little bit. There we go. Okay. So now that we're centered and we're ready to go, the next thing we need to do is to get that clay. And as I talked about, we can't just leave this loose on the wheel. It has to have something holding it in place. And so for myself, when I do trimming, I use a small amount of clay, and you don't want very much, right? You want this to be clay that's a little bit more firm than the clay that you use for the throwing. And I'm going to create 3 lugs, not 4, and not a ring of clay. You just want a tripod of equal balance of clay that you are going to create into like a nice little kind of elongated nugget. I lick my clay. It's something that my professor, Victor Babu, taught me a long time ago. It's just the right amount of moisture to get it to stick. If that seems really disgusting to you, you're more than welcome to take your finger, dip it into the tiniest bit of water, and then attach it. But please be careful about doing that, because that water can sometimes adhere to the side of your pot and then rip your rim off, which is what we want to avoid, okay? So from here, I've got my 3 lugs equally distributed, and I'm centered as I turn around my wheel. You guys see that? Okay? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in, and with those beginner kits that you guys have, right, we've got that big tool and that small tool. I'm going to start off by defining what that foot needs to look like with that corner, square, smaller loop. And so when I come in here, do I want to make a little tiny foot that's itty bitty in the center of this piece? Do you guys see that? Do you see those marks that I've just made? Right, I've got these 2 little tiny marks. What's going to happen to my bowl if I have this little tiny foot in this huge, big, rounded bowl?
It'll tip over.
That's right, it's just going to tip over. So it might look really pretty as like a side profile, but functionally it is less than ideal. So it's imperative that we have a bowl that is substantial to the girth and the width of that piece. And so because when I threw this and when I cut away with my undercutting tool, I really want to use as much of this as what I have. If your bottom of your piece was wider at the base, you would maybe cut more away. So to start off with, I'm going to establish that the exterior of my foot is going to be here, and the interior of my foot is here. So I've created this little tiny indication, this marker, and then I'm going to put an X in the middle to explain to you what I'm cutting away, and then I'm cutting away on the side. So I'm trimming here and in the center here, but what I want to do is to create a beautiful foot that shows and that the piece is uplifted, it's lighter, and it's ideal for function, okay? So when we trim, we have to trim fast. If you are trimming slowly, it's like a freehand circle versus using a compass. Make sure that that wheel is moving fast as you're working around. Make sure that just like when you throw, that you are leaning forward, your body is engaged in the wheel, and that you are not just free, loosey-goosey with your trimming tool. That you're coming in, you're supporting your wrist with your other arm, and that this wheel is moving fast. And like the skin of an apple, you are going to peel away little by little of this pot to get it into the form you want. So from an angle, you can see that I'm starting to come in, and you can see these little curly cues start to come off of my pot. And when I go to my line where I marked, and you can see my little shavings. My shavings are ideal for trimming. So it's an indicator as well. So if you're trimming and your clay is sticking to the loop tool, right? It's just gunking all up inside your loop tool. What is that an indicator of?
It's too wet.
It is too wet. It is way too wet. So what about the opposite? What if I'm shaving this off and then I have these huge flaky shavings of like Parmesan cheese flying at my face and all over the floor? What is that an indication of? It's too dry, right? So it's way too dry. So making sure you're paying attention to your pieces, not waiting too long, and then they just kind of like, you know, you want these to be perfect, like little curly Q noodles that kind of come off your piece. So as I'm carving away, I'm making that distinction, and I'm working from the inside. You can work from the outside as well, working my way back and forth. Same thing here. I'm starting to dig down into the side profile of my piece because again, I want to echo that beautiful curvilinear internal shape. So I'm cutting that foot into the form, and I'm also carving along into the side. So I'm going to get my larger tool. Remember we talked about this as well to deal with my profile. I'm going to just kind of use that along the side to carve away. It's imperative that when you learn the practice and you build your kind of understanding of trimming, you should not be trimming all the way down to the bottom of the pot. The integrity of how you throw the form, and because of function of like, you know, time, you should only be trimming half to a quarter of the way from the foot, and always. If you are trimming all the way down to the bottom of the form, you need to reevaluate how you're throwing your pieces and why they're so thick, and you need to trim them down. So let's like stop for a second and look at what I've made. So I've got this really nice foot. I've got this nice curvilinear shape. Let's like look inside there. We can see that I've cut that form away. Now what we need to do is think about how that form is, am I cutting enough into the bottom, right? So what we need to do is there's lots of different ways that ceramic artists kind of approach how far do I need to trim away this form. Some tap, like a melon, and they're like, oh yeah, that sounds right. Others do a pushing technique. They kind of push a little bit, and when you push, you get like a little resistance. I'm not good with picking out melons at the grocery store myself, so the tapping technique, falls deaf to my ears. I'm more of a pusher, so I kind of push a little bit, and so I can tell that this isn't giving me any kind of like little kind of push-pull, like I'm not getting any kind of like a indentation, that I still need to trim a little bit more. And because that shape is curvilinear on the inside of the form, I also want to create a little bit of a curvilinear in my foot itself. So coming in with my tool, I'm going to carve a little bit more into this to take away more of those nice noodly shavings. And I really want to emphasize for beginners that if you are trimming a pot and you are terrified about going too far, and so you just don't. Let's say that you make it and you're like barely kind of trim it at all, because you can really see that this shape has really transformed. It doesn't look like the same pot it did before. And that's the point of trimming. We don't want to just kind of come in and like kind of just barely change it. We really want to make sure that these forms have a nice weight inside and out. That is the benefit of trimming. Trimming really defines how a pot takes form and aesthetic. And you can really kind of play around with that a little bit. And so to say that, make sure that you are really getting that nice shape as you're forming your piece. So from here, I'm almost done. I'm pretty happy with what I've created. I like to come in with my smooth metal rib and kind of clean up any of those lines along the sides. The last thing that I think is really important is for the foot that it's not a 90-degree angle. This is something that I teach my students because I think that a 90-degree angle is likely to get chipped in the kiln if it gets grabbed onto maybe a piece like a dirty shelf, or even in your home it can scratch the surface of your beautiful furniture. So what I like to do is I kind of come in and I just do a curvilinear kind of take off the edge of that foot, and then I also like to burnish with the back end of my tool. So taking the back end of your wooden tool and kind of come in and kind of round this out a little bit. And so what it creates is this really nice curvilinear kind of angle, so that the surface of the foot of your piece doesn't affect the surface that it's sitting on as likely. Handmade pots have a huge reputation for scratching wooden surfaces once they're finished. So avoiding that as much as possible is ideal. Okay? So coming to an end, I now need to come in and take my lugs off. So I'm going to take one lug off at a time. And you can see that when I pull my lug off, that I'm not pulling off any of my pot. There's barely any kind of moisture or kind of, residual on that. Coming to my next one as I start to pull the clay away. So this is the one that I added with water. And you can see that it actually has pulled away a little bit, and it is actually sticking a little bit to my pot. And that's from using the water, whereas like just using the, where I licked it, it kind of comes off really nice and easily. So because I have a little bit of that residual clay still on there, I'm going to use the smoothness of my rib just to clean it off very nicely. This is the ideal time to sign your pieces. So to sign your pieces, you can approach it any way you want. I like to take a dull pencil because a pencil or a pen is our most common, writing utensil, and just kind of come in and I literally carve my name into the bottom of the piece with that dull pencil, and you can actually see that signature, and the form is actually really nice and delicate. You can see that I've got a nice profile, and the weight is nice as well. And it echoes that same shape on the inside. Okay? So this is the trimming demonstration on how to trim a bowl.